Have you ever noticed that some people seem to walk through an invisible world, where the rules aren't the same as yours? They speak little, act with surgical precision, and before you know it, they're miles ahead while you're still running in circles. It's not talent. It's not luck. It's something colder, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. They see the structure behind the scenes. Machiavelli would call this reading the board before the first move. Years ago, I still believed in the comfortable narrative that effort equals justice and that time rewards everyone equally. I carried with me the morality of exhaustion, the religion of persistence, the secret pride of those who bleed in silence, believing that this, in itself, has value. Until a banal conversation with a mentor shattered this myth like a blade piercing the veil. We were talking about a well-known name, one you would recognize effortlessly. I asked how much he earned. The answer came without drama in a slow month, a few $100,000. At that moment, something died inside me. Not envy, but the illusion that we were playing the same game. Machiavelli wrote that the man who believes he lives in equality is the most vulnerable of all, because he enters the battlefield blindfolded with justice while the other enters with a map of the terrain. I didn't understand this yet, but I felt the effect. It wasn't about money. It was about position. It was about seeing what is hidden from the eyes of those trained to obey the rhythm, not the strategy. I returned home that night with a restlessness that kept me awake. How does one reach a level that seems to violate the mathematics of the ordinary world? The answer didn't come in pretty phrases. It came in an internal collapse. I began to realize that my income wasn't a reflection of my ability, but of where I was planted. I was like a general fighting honorably on an irrelevant hill while the other controls the supply routes. Machiavelli warned that victory is not won by the one who fights best, but by the one who chooses the terrain of the fight best. This thought began to erode my certainties. I started to revisit everything I believed about work, merit, patience. With each page of Machiavelli, a layer of naivete fell away. He never wrote to comfort. He wrote to awaken those who wish to survive the invisible games of power. When he says that man dependent on his own effort is always at the mercy of fortune, it's not poetry. It's a clinical diagnosis of a soul condemned to perpetual wear and tear. I began to see the world as he saw it, not as it should be, but as it is. I realized that people who accumulate power don't pursue results, they build mechanisms that produce results without their presence. And here the mind resists, because we have been molded to confuse sweat with virtue. Machiavelli would have no pity for this confusion. For him, virtue is effectiveness. Everything else is theater to keep those who run away from the levers. Have you ever wondered why some men seem to go through decades in a few months, while others spend their entire lives accumulating fatigue? This question began to throb within me like an emergency signal. The answer wasn't in self-help books, but in the cold subtext of history. Empires aren't built by calloused hands, but by minds that understand how the world moves when no one is watching. I began to observe the silent ones, not the noisy ones. Those who speak little in public, but control the narratives behind the scenes. Those who don't compete for space, but reshape it. Machiavelli said that true power rarely announces itself, it insinuates itself. It hides beneath the appearance of normality while reconfiguring reality. Gradually, an idea began to emerge. As uncomfortable as all real truths, I was trying to win by running faster on a track that leads nowhere. I didn't yet know what to call it, but I felt the psychological weight of the discovery. It was like waking up in a theater and realizing you're not on stage, but in the audience, applauding a play written by others. If you feel discomfort now, don't fight it. Machiavelli would say that this is the first crack in the mental prison. It's the moment when the mind begins to break free from taught morality and starts to seek the real mechanics of things. Because once you see that there are invisible games being played above your head, there's no going back to naivete. The question isn't whether you work hard. The question is whether you're fighting in the field someone else chose for you. And that changes everything. Hold on to that feeling. Don't explain it. Don't rationalize it. Just observe how it resonates within you. Because in the next step, we're going to cross the line that separates effort from leverage, And it's there that Machiavelli ceases to be a historical author and becomes an unforgiving mirror of his own position in the world. After that first crack opened in my mind, nothing ever went back to the way it was. I started noticing small details that had previously gone unnoticed, as if Machiavelli had placed an invisible filter over my eyes. I began observing colleagues, local business owners, seemingly ordinary people. Everyone moved a lot, talked a lot, complained a lot. And yet, they seemed frozen in the same point in their lives for years. The routine repeated itself like a sacred ritual: waking up early, facing traffic, solving never-ending problems, returning home exhausted and convincing oneself that this was progress. I lived like that too. And that's when I understood how comfortable this narrative is, because it absolves us of the responsibility of thinking strategically. Machiavelli would never have allowed himself to be hypnotized by this incessant movement. He clearly saw that those who run all day have no time to choose a direction. The man too busy to reflect is the perfect man to be governed. I began to notice this in the simplest gestures: the person who prides themselves on not stopping even for lunch, the one who boasts about answering emails at 2 in the morning, the one who measures their worth by their level of exhaustion. Behind this image of dedication, there is a silent fear of stopping and discovering that all this effort builds nothing that survives it. One afternoon, stuck in a seemingly endless bank queue, I observed the people around me as if witnessing a scene from a Machiavelli novel. Each face bore a small, accepted defeat. Everyone waited patiently to resolve a problem created by systems they couldn't control. I then thought of something he wrote about dependency: when a man doesn't control the means of his own survival, he becomes docile without realizing it. The queue wasn't just physical. It was symbolic. It was a portrait of a lifetime waiting for permission. It was during this phase that I realized that many men believe they are in motion when, in reality, they are merely spinning within a closed circuit. They change jobs, take courses, move to different cities, but never change their position on the board. Machiavelli would call this false mobility, the kind of change that keeps the structure intact while deceiving the mind with a sensation of progress. There was one particular night that crystallized everything. I was talking to an old friend, someone I always admired for his discipline. He would wake up before sunrise, run, study, work late. I deeply respected him. At some point, he told me, with a tired smile, that despite all that, he felt his financial life was always in the same place. The tone of resignation was what hurt the most. He wasn't angry. He was resigned. There, sitting in front of me, was the exact portrait of what Machiavelli warned centuries ago: men who become excellent servants of a system that will never give them power. This realization haunted me. I began to see the difference between movement and actual displacement. A man can run 10 kilometers a day and still end up exactly where he started. Another can take a single strategic step and change the course of his entire trajectory. Machiavelli wasn't talking about speed, he was talking about positioning. The tragedy is that we've been trained to admire those who exhaust themselves, not those who reposition themselves. What's most disturbing is that this programming starts early. At school, we are praised for completing tasks, not for questioning structures. At work, we are promoted for solving problems, not for redesigning the system that creates them. Gradually, we internalize the idea that effort is synonymous with virtue, and so we become predictable. Machiavelli would say that predictability is the first step towards domination. There was a moment when this logic hit me like an unexpected twist. I was at home, organizing old papers, when I found notes from years ago. Goals, plans, promises I made to myself. The yellowed paper seemed to mock me. I had changed the scenarios, but not the mental model. I kept trying to gain strength from the same weaknesses. It was then that I understood something uncomfortable. I wasn't being defeated by a lack of ability, but by excessive obedience to a script I never questioned. Machiavelli always insisted that most men live under inherited, not chosen, ideas. They don't realize that their own worldview is already a prison. When this idea takes hold, you begin to feel a different kind of unease. It's not anxiety, it's lucidity. It's realizing that the life you call normal was designed to keep you functional, not powerful. Perhaps you recognize something of this in your own routine. Perhaps you feel you're doing everything right, and yet nothing really changes. This is the point where the mind begins to open a dangerous crack, the possibility that the way you measure progress is wrong. Machiavelli never offered comfort to those who reach this conclusion. He simply holds up the mirror and observes in silence. And it is precisely in this silence that the question arises that almost no one dares to ask: if all this effort isn't getting me anywhere, what exactly am I building? Keep this question in mind. It is the gateway. Because from here on out, we will no longer talk about exhaustion, but about something that completely redefines the game: the real level of value you deliver to the world. After realizing that most people run without getting anywhere, I began to see something even more disturbing. It wasn't just the effort that was misdirected, it was the very concept of value that was distorted within the collective mind. Machiavelli never judged men by the amount of sweat they produced, but by the strategic utility they represented within a system. He observed kings, generals, merchants, and traders with the same clinical eye, always seeking the same silent answer: who is indispensable and who can be discarded without the structure collapsing. When you start thinking like that, everyday life takes on a strange tone. The office ceases to be a workplace and becomes a micro-kingdom where each position exists to sustain something larger, rarely to liberate the person who occupies it. I began to observe my own tasks as if I were outside my body. Each meeting, each report, each obligation seemed like a small brick stacked to maintain a wall that didn't belong to me. I performed with precision, received praise, but none of that altered my real position on the board. Machiavelli wrote that the man who serves too well builds his own cage with his own hands, because he becomes efficient in strengthening the order that keeps him dependent. This phrase echoed in my mind as I watched weeks dissolve into activities that generated nothing that would survive me. It was at this point that I realized that value is not something absolute, it is hierarchical. There are tasks that feed systems and there are tasks that create them. The difference lies not in the difficulty, but in the scope. A man can be the best executor in the world and still be invisible in the architecture of power. The discomfort of this idea is profound, because it destroys the belief that technical excellence, in itself, is a form of sovereignty. Have you ever wondered why some people seem essential while others are quietly replaced, as if they never existed? This thought led me to a painful review of my own trajectory. I realized that I had invested years in becoming reliable, but not irreplaceable. I knew how to do things, but I didn't know how to design them. I executed, but I didn't decide. Machiavelli would see this as the perfect portrait of a man too useful to be free. The more efficient you become at solving problems within a structure, the less incentive the structure has to allow you to question it. I then began to experiment with small mental breaks. Instead of asking, how do I do this better, I started asking, why does this need to exist this way? It was a silent, almost secret exercise, because I quickly realized that systems don't like those who try to understand their internal logic. They prefer hands, not minds. Machiavelli warned that the first step to escaping a subordinate position is to understand the mechanisms that sustain the power of others. These reflections took shape when I began to notice that money, in itself, doesn't reward effort or quality, but impact. Impact is the invisible measure that transcends people, borders, and contexts. A single email can generate more value than weeks of manual work, not because it's more difficult, but because it operates on a different level of influence. The mind resists accepting this because we were raised to confuse weight with importance. When was the last time you questioned whether what you do every day actually changes something structural in your life? This questioning opened an unexpected rift. I realized that most people have never been trained to think in terms of reach. They focus on what is within their reach, not on what is within the reach of ideas. Machiavelli understood that modern power is not sustained by physical force, but by the ability to shape perceptions. Whoever controls the narrative controls the battlefield before it even exists. I then began to study not only what people did, but what their actions produced beyond themselves. A salesperson who closes deals is valued, but someone who designs the sales method shapes the destiny of all salespeople. A teacher who explains content is respected, but whoever defines the curriculum decides the future of thousands of minds. The difference is not moral, it is structural. Machiavelli never romanticized this fact. He merely described it as a natural law of human organizations. This observation brought an uncomfortable revelation. Perhaps I had never been paid for what I was worth, but only for what I replaced. As long as I remained tied to functions that could be replicated, my income would always be negotiable. The market doesn't reward the effort of those who can be replaced, it rewards the scarcity of those who change the game. Have you ever noticed how the truly influential people are almost never on the front lines, but behind the scenes where the real decisions are made? Gradually, the feeling of being trapped in a model began to transform into something more dangerous: clarity. I could no longer ignore the gap between what I was doing and what I was actually building. Each activity began to be evaluated under a new criterion: does this make me more indispensable or just busier? This simple question dismantles entire careers. Machiavelli said that the most difficult men to dominate are those whose presence alters the environment, not merely fills it. When someone enters a room and everything changes, he is not there to serve, he is there to redefine. That is the difference between operational value and structural value, although almost no one uses these terms consciously. And perhaps this is where the most unexpected turning point arises: understanding that, as long as you remain at the execution level, you will always be asking permission from the world. The real leap begins when you stop asking yourself how to do better and start asking what needs to be created. This transition is not comfortable. It requires you to abandon the security of being competent to face the risk of being strategic. If tomorrow you stopped running and started drawing, what exactly would change around you? There was a period in my life when I began to feel as if I were living in two worlds at the same time. One was the visible one, made of commitments, goals, deadlines, and demands. The other was silent, subterranean, almost clandestine, where I observed patterns that most people ignore. This duality didn't arise from academic curiosity, but from psychological necessity. After understanding that value is hierarchical, I realized that continuing to act as before would be a slow form of self-deception. Machiavelli said that nothing is more dangerous than the man who no longer believes in the narrative that sustains his own position. I began to distance myself from certain routines that seemed sacred. I didn't abandon my work, but I started to see it as an experimental field. I silently wondered, if I disappear tomorrow, what really stops? The answer was almost always uncomfortable. In many cases, nothing essential. Someone else would take my place, and the machine would keep turning. Machiavelli would have called this the ultimate proof of structural irrelevance. The mind rejects this realization because it wounds identity, but it's impossible to build power on illusions. During that same period, I read a report that deeply affected me. It analyzed the fortunes of some of the world's richest men and revealed that most of them had concentrated their greatest increases in wealth during periods of economic crisis. While multitudes froze, they moved with surgical precision. They bought bankrupt companies, despised assets, and discredited ideas. One specific piece of data impressed me during a global recession. Certain investors doubled their wealth in less than 2 years, while the dominant discourse was one of retrenchment and fear. This seemed to contradict everything we are taught about security, but it fit perfectly with Machiavelli's thinking, who saw chaos not as a threat, but as a fertile ground for repositioning. I then began to understand how most people react to collapse. Ordinary people see a crisis as a sign to shrink, cut back, wait. Strategic men see it as a forced reorganization of the chessboard. While one side flees, the other occupies. While one side laments, the other gathers. This behavior does not stem from optimism, but from a cold reading of reality. Machiavelli warned that fortune is like an untamed river. Whoever only builds when the waters are calm will be swept away by the first flood. An unlikely event reinforced this in an almost symbolic way. I was at a small private event, without spotlights, no big names. During a break, I overheard two men talking about buying a business that everyone thought was dead. The tone was almost casual, as if they were talking about dinner. Months later, that same business resurfaced, revamped, multiplying in value. No one outside that circle understood what had happened. To them, it seemed like luck. To me, it was already obvious they had seen structure where others saw ruin. This type of episode taught me that collective perception is delayed. Most people only recognize value when it has already been legitimized, when the media has already spoken about it, when the risk has already been absorbed by someone more audacious. Machiavelli would never have placed himself in the line of those who wait for confirmation. He wrote for those who create facts, not for those who react to them. The more I delved into this way of seeing the world, the stranger everyday life became. I observed endless discussions about productivity, balance, well-being, and realized that they all stemmed from the same hidden premise that the current system is immutable. No one discusses how to redesign the machinery, only how to survive within it. This limitation is psychological before it is material. It's the kind of prison that disguises itself as common sense. A curious fact I found reinforced this impression. Studies on behavior show that people exposed to highly controlled environments for long periods tend to lose initiative even when freedom is restored. They remain waiting for instructions that no longer exist. This explains why so many men continue to ask permission to grow, even when nothing external prevents them. Machiavelli would say that the habit of obedience is harder to break than any physical wall. Gradually, I came to understand that the greatest resistance to change doesn't come from the world, but from a mind trained to interpret stability as a virtue. Crises, for this mind, are aberrations. For a Machiavellian mind, they are transitions. They are moments when reality becomes malleable. Most people can't tolerate this fluidity because it demands decisions without guarantees. Perhaps that's why so many remain stuck in careers that no longer produce real growth. They see burnout as an inevitable price to pay, not as a sign of structural misalignment. I myself experienced this for years. The difference now was that I could no longer pretend not to see it. Every repetitive task, every empty goal, every pointless meeting seemed to scream the same message: you are supporting something that doesn't support you. This kind of clarity is uncomfortable. It doesn't bring immediate relief. On the contrary, it creates an initial void, as if the ground had been pulled out from under your feet. Machiavelli never promised tranquility. He promised vision. And vision, when it arrives, usually demolishes the artificial peace we build to survive. It was in this state of suspension that I understood something crucial: it's not enough to understand the hierarchy of value. It's necessary to act differently when the world trembles. And this leads us to the most delicate point of all, the one that separates observers from architects: the ability to decide when everyone else hesitates. When you spend enough time observing men in moments of rupture, you realize something that almost no one admits: most don't fear loss, but the freedom that follows it. Machiavelli described this with elegant cruelty when he stated that men endure adversity better than autonomy, because adversity comes with invisible instructions, while autonomy demands decision. And deciding is the loneliest act there is. There was a period when everything around me seemed unstable. Projects that once seemed secure began to crumble. Contacts drifted away. Opportunities disappeared without warning. On the outside, it seemed like bad luck. On the inside, I felt that something was being rearranged, as if the chessboard was being forcibly cleared. It was at that moment that I understood that prolonged stability is a form of anesthesia. It prevents a person from realizing that the terrain has already shifted. Machiavelli would say that fortune only reveals its true face when it removes the crutches. I remember one particular night when I spent hours staring at a document that represented years of work. Everything I had built up to that point was in that file. All I had to do was continue, follow the line, keep the gears turning. But for the first time, I clearly saw that this path, although comfortable, would not lead me anywhere that truly mattered. The tension was physical. My body craved security, but my mind could no longer accept repetition. It was then that I understood that the true turning point is not an external opportunity, but the internal willingness to break with what still works, but no longer serves. Machiavelli wrote that a man's greatest mistake is to confuse continuity with progress. This phrase began to resonate as a warning. How many times do we maintain structures simply because they haven't yet collapsed? How many decisions are postponed not for lack of options, but for fear of losing an identity built over years? I realized that I wasn't just facing a professional choice, but a personal reconstruction. I would have to abandon not only a project, but the version of myself that had become comfortable within it. Then something unexpected happened. A casual conversation with someone I barely knew changed the course of everything. He told me, almost without realizing it, how he had abandoned a stable career to build something of his own, without guarantees, without an audience, only with a clear vision of what he wanted to control. There was no heroism in his tone, just a strange serenity. When I asked if he hadn't been afraid, he replied simply, "I was, but the fear of continuing was greater." That sentence landed like a precise cut. Machiavelli wouldn't have spoken differently. In the following days, I began to feel a kind of silent urgency. It wasn't anxiety, it was clarity. I could no longer ignore the distance between what I was doing and what I wanted to build. Every old task seemed heavy, almost useless. At the same time, new ideas emerged chaotically, as if my mind were testing paths I hadn't even considered possible before. It was confusing, but there was energy in it. Machiavelli said that fortune favors the bold, but he never made it clear that boldness isn't noise, it's internal alignment with what needs to be done. Then came the turning point. A project I considered secondary, almost an experiment, began to gain unexpected traction. Nothing grandiose at first, but enough to show me that there was life outside the old model. Meanwhile, what I considered my main pillar began to show signs of exhaustion. It was as if the world was pushing me out of a place I no longer belonged. Machiavelli would have called this a sign of fortune, that moment when reality seems to conspire to test whether you have the courage to cross the threshold of the door that has opened. This transition was anything but smooth. There were days of deep doubt, sleepless nights, that feeling of betraying one's own history. But at the same time, there was a strange sense of integrity. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to circumstances, but creating new conditions. The difference is subtle, but devastating. When you react, the world dictates the pace. When you create, you become part of the machinery that sets the pace. I began to understand that most people never reach that point because they prefer known pain to fertile uncertainty. They wait for something external to push them, a crisis big enough to justify change. Machiavelli warned that this kind of waiting is a refined form of cowardice. The man who only moves when there is no alternative has already surrendered his power before the battle even begins. With each small step forward on this new path, my perception of time began to shift. What once took months now happened in weeks. What seemed distant began to approach in an almost disturbing way. I wasn't working anymore, I was operating on a different frequency. It was as if I had left a congested highway for an air route that few can see. There were no guarantees, but there was direction. This phase taught me something that no book had managed to convey with such force. The real decision is not an isolated event. It is a permanent state of willingness to abandon what no longer builds a future. Machiavelli never separated power from inner responsibility. For him, the mind that clings to what was cannot govern what will be. Now, looking back, I see that that period wasn't a crisis, but an initiation. I had to lose comfort to gain perspective. I had to stop being reliable to become necessary. And, above all, I had to accept that there are no shortcuts to personal sovereignty. There is only the moment when you decide to stop asking permission from your own history. And it is precisely here that the journey reaches its most delicate point, because after all this, the question arises that no one can answer for you. What are you willing to let die so that something greater can be born? If you've made it this far, something inside you is no longer the same. Not because I've taught you something new, but because Machiavelli has simply restored a vision that has always been dormant, the perception that life is not driven by merit, but by position. This understanding is not comfortable. It offers no absolution. It offers responsibility. And responsibility is the purest form of psychological power. Perhaps now you are looking at your own trajectory with a mixture of lucidity and discomfort. Each old choice begins to take on new contours. You begin to realize that many decisions were not truly yours, but invisible inheritances of a mental model that was never questioned. Machiavelli would say that man only begins to govern himself when he recognizes the origin of the chains that bind him. This recognition is not a moral judgment. It is a starting point. The practical path begins with something simple, yet profoundly underestimated: observing your own routine as if you were an external strategist. Ask yourself coldly, without self-pity, where your time truly produces something that doesn't depend on your continuous presence. List the activities that only generate results while you are there, and then those that continue to generate results even when you are away. This difference, almost always ignored, is the boundary between survival and building something. Next, change the way you learn. Stop consuming information just to feel busy. Start studying with the intention of repositioning yourself. Don't look for isolated techniques. Look for transferable principles, those that work in any context. Machiavelli has endured for centuries because he didn't write about events, but about patterns. When you learn to recognize patterns, you cease to be a hostage to circumstances. Another essential step is to reclaim authority over your own language. Words shape perception, and perception shapes destiny. Observe how you talk about yourself, about money, about opportunities. If your internal dialogue is full of limitations, the world only confirms the script you've already written. Replace the question, "What can I do?" with "What needs to be created so that I am no longer replaceable?" This change seems subtle, but it redefines everything. There is also an emotional dimension that cannot be ignored. Throughout this journey, you will feel fear, doubt, and loneliness. This is not a sign of error. It is a sign of real displacement. Machiavelli never promised comfort to those who decide to change their position on the chessboard. He knew that every true strategic move requires the symbolic death of an old identity. You don't just lose habits, you lose the version of yourself that was useful in a world you no longer want to inhabit. In practice, this means starting small but thinking big. Don't wait for a dramatic break. Begin by dedicating some of your time to building something that can grow without you, whether it's an idea, a project, a communication skill, or a structure that amplifies your impact. The goal isn't to abandon everything immediately, but to progressively shift the center of your life from that endeavor to architecture. At the same time, cultivate decision-making as a discipline. Don't treat important choices as preferences. Treat them as commitments. When you decide, you cut off alternative paths and force the world to reorganize itself around you. This is not mysticism. It's applied psychology. The human mind responds to clarity with action. Prolonged doubt only preserves the current state. Perhaps the most difficult step is accepting that no one will come to rescue you from this transition. There is no perfect mentor, no definitive manual. Machiavelli wrote for men who were willing to walk without guarantees, because he knew that real power is not inherited. It is conquered internally before it manifests externally. Every day that you choose to think like an architect and not like an executor, something invisible is reconfigured. Allow yourself, then, this silent gesture of sovereignty. Rewrite the role you occupy in your own story, not as a victim of circumstances, but as someone who understands the hidden rules and decides to operate them in their favor. It's not about dominating others, but about ceasing to be dominated by structures you never consciously chose. Now, before we wrap up, I want you to do something simple yet powerful. Think of a belief you've held for years about money, work, or success that you now realize was limiting you. It doesn't have to be a fancy phrase. It can be just 2 words. Write it in the comments, even anonymously. To this symbolic act marks the beginning of change. If this content resonated with you, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and follow our upcoming reflections. Here, we're not talking about shortcuts, but about structure. And after seeing The Invisible Game, you already know there's no going back to playing the game the way it was before.